She was left to die with her newborn until the widowed rancher said, "You're coming home." In the dead of winter, a young mother lies in the snow, her baby barely breathing. Townsfolk whisper, "Turn away," until one man steps forward. A lonely rancher, still mourning his own family, lifts her into his wagon. His act of mercy shocks the whole town. But mercy comes with a price. The law says the husband can claim her. The railroad wants her silenced. And buried in her past is a secret, a deed, a death, and a truth powerful enough to shake the frontier. As whispers grow into threats, and the church bell tolls over a town divided, one question burns hotter than the hearth fire. Will this broken rancher and cast-out mother find a family in each other? Or will the world tear them apart before their second chance can even begin? Before we begin, I invite you to take a breath. This space is for the quiet believers, the ones who know small kindnesses can ripple into something greater. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered streets of the Colorado mining town. Mariah's legs trembled with each step, her strength fading as she clutched her tiny bundle closer to her chest. The newborn's weak cries were barely audible above the howling winter wind that cut through her thin shawl like icy daggers. Her vision blurred as she stumbled past the general store. The baby needed warmth, needed milk, needs she could no longer provide. Her husband's final cruel words echoed in her mind as he'd driven away, leaving her and her child to the mercy of the elements. The livery stable's weathered walls offered little shelter as she sank to her knees in the deepening snow. "Please me, Amor," she whispered to her daughter. "Stay strong." But her own strength was failing, the exhaustion of childbirth and exposure taking their toll. The world began to spin as she slumped against the rough wooden wall. Ethan McCall pulled his wagon to a stop outside Henderson's general store, his shopping list for ranch supplies heavy in his coat pocket. The setting sun painted the snow-covered mountains blood red, reminding him it would be dark soon. Best to hurry. But something was wrong. A crowd was gathering near the livery, their murmurs carrying on the bitter wind. He tied off his horses and strode toward the commotion, his boots crunching through the fresh powder. The crowd parted as he approached, revealing a young woman collapsed in the snow, clutching something to her chest. His heart clenched when he realized it was a baby, wrapped in what looked like nothing more than a thin blanket. "Ain't natural," someone muttered. "Mexican girl, unmarried most likely." "Ruined, she is." Ethan's jaw tightened as he watched the woman struggle to lift her head. Her eyes were glazed with fever, her lips blue with cold. The baby's cries had grown weaker, barely a whimper now. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his heavy wool coat and knelt beside her. "Ma'am," he said softly, "can you hear me?" Mariah tried to focus on the stranger's face, fear warring with desperation. "Me Bibi," she whispered. "Please help her." The crowd's whispers grew louder, scandalized. Ethan recognized several faces from church, their judgment clear in their expressions. His reputation in the town had always been spotless, the quiet widower, the hard-working rancher. What he was about to do would change all that. He didn't care. "You're coming home," he declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. Carefully he wrapped his coat around both mother and child. Mariah was light in his arms, too light. As he lifted her from the snow, gasps rippled through the onlookers. Mrs. Henderson, the shopkeeper's wife, pressed a hand to her chest. "Mr. McCall, you cannot mean to." "I can and I do," he cut her off, his voice firm but calm. The same quiet authority that had served him well managing ranch hands now silenced the crowd. He carried Maria to his wagon, settling her and the baby in the back where he'd piled fresh hay for the return journey. As he climbed onto the driver's seat and took up the reins, Ethan felt the weight of dozens of stares. He'd lived alone these past 5 years since losing Sarah and their infant daughter to fever. The solitude had become a comfort, a shelter from the pain of loss. Now, with one impulsive act of mercy, he'd shattered that carefully maintained peace. The horses' hooves beat a steady rhythm as they left the town behind. In the gathering dusk, coyotes began their evening chorus, their cries echoing off the snow-covered hills. Ethan glanced back at his passengers. Mariah had curled around her baby, both of them buried in his coat. Her eyes were closed, but her lips moved in what might have been prayer. The image stirred something in his chest, a memory of Sarah, holding their Catherine in those precious few days before the fever took them both. He'd promised Sarah, as she lay dying, that he would never let another mother suffer as she had. He'd assumed it was an empty promise, words of comfort to ease her passing. Now, as his wagon carried them through the deepening night toward his ranch, Ethan wondered if he'd just kept that promise or made the biggest mistake of his life. The town's gossip would spread like wildfire. His peaceful existence was surely over. Yet as another weak cry drifted up from the wagon bed, followed by Mariah's soft singing in Spanish, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. The snow began to fall again, erasing their tracks as they headed home. The wagon creaked and swayed through the deepening snow, each mile slower than the last. Ethan kept glancing back at his passengers, worry creasing his weathered face. Mariah drifted between sleep and waking, her soft Spanish lullabies barely audible above the whistle of the winter wind. "Stay with me, ma'am," he called back, his voice gentle but firm. "Dawn's coming soon. We'll have you both warm before you know it." The baby's cries had grown weaker, and that concerned him most. He'd seen what winter could do to the smallest and most vulnerable. His horses struggled through another drift, their breath steaming in the frozen air. The night seemed endless, but finally, the eastern sky began to lighten. "Almost there," Ethan murmured, more to himself than his passengers. "Just hold on." As the sun crept over the horizon, his ranch house came into view, a sturdy two-story structure of rough-hewn logs, weathered by years of Colorado seasons. Smoke still curled from the chimney where he'd banked the morning fire before heading to town. The sight had never been more welcome. Ethan pulled the wagon right up to the front door. Mariah stirred as he lifted her, the baby still clutched to her chest. "Me baby," she whispered, her eyes glazed with fever. "She's right here with you," he assured her, shouldering open the door. The house was cold, but not frozen. He laid Mariah on the sofa near the fireplace, tucking his coat around her and the infant. His hands remembered their old sureness as he built up the fire, adding kindling and logs until flames crackled bright and warm. The coffee pot went on first. He'd need his wits about him. While it brewed, he filled his largest pot with snow and set it to melt and warm by the fire. The baby would need washing, and Mariah's fever worried him. His movements were quick but quiet as he gathered clean towels and the softest flannel shirt he owned. The coffee's familiar aroma filled the room as he worked, and Mariah's eyes fluttered open. Fear and confusion crossed her face as she took in the strange surroundings. "I'm sorry," she whispered, struggling to sit up. "We are too much trouble. We should go." "No." Ethan's voice was soft but brooked no argument. He poured a cup of coffee and brought it to her. "My wife Sarah died of fever 5 winters ago. Our daughter Catherine with her." He paused, the old pain catching in his throat. "I won't see another woman and child die, not when I can help." Tears welled in Mariah's eyes as she accepted the cup with trembling hands. "Gracias," she murmured. "Thank you." The water had warmed enough. Ethan helped her wash the baby, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he supported the tiny head. The child's cries grew stronger as she was cleaned and wrapped in warm flannel, a sound that lightened something in his chest. Morning sun cut through the frost on the windows, painting patterns on the wooden floor. Mariah settled back against the sofa cushions, adjusting her blouse to nurse her daughter. Ethan quietly excused himself to tend to the horses. Outside, the dawn air was sharp and clean. He worked methodically, unhitching the team, rubbing them down, ensuring they had feed and fresh water. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the scene inside. The sound of Mariah's soft singing, the weight of the baby in his hands. His heart felt strange, like a clock long stopped suddenly ticking again. He took longer than necessary in the barn, giving Mariah privacy and himself time to steady his emotions. When he finally returned to the house, the sun was setting. Mariah had managed to doze off, her daughter sleeping peacefully against her chest. The sight stopped him in the doorway. She stared at his entrance, her dark eyes finding his. "Senator McCall," she said softly, "God sent you to us. I know this in my heart." Ethan stood before the fireplace, staring into the flames. The words stirred something deep inside him, that promise to Sarah, the years of loneliness, the sudden chance to help. He couldn't deny the feeling that this moment was meant to be, though such thoughts made him uneasy. He added another log to the fire, watching the sparks rise. Behind him, Mariah hummed another lullaby, and his heart beat with that strange new rhythm, protective, uncertain, and undeniably alive. Morning sunlight streamed through the frost-edged windows of the ranch house. The kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke as Ethan moved about, his boots scuffing against the plank floor. He'd risen before dawn, as always, to tend to the animals and start breakfast. Now beans simmered in an iron pot while biscuits browned in the oven. The creak of floorboards announced Mariah's approach. She appeared in the doorway, looking pale but steadier than the night before. The baby was wrapped snugly against her chest in a shawl he'd found in an old trunk. "Please," Ethan said, pulling out a chair. "Sit and eat." Mariah eased herself down, wincing slightly. "Gracias," she murmured, adjusting the sleeping infant. Her dark eyes followed his movements as he filled 2 plates with steaming beans and golden biscuits. The kitchen felt quiet, save for the clink of spoons and the soft whisper of the baby's breathing. Ethan could feel questions hanging in the air between them, as heavy as storm clouds. Finally, Mariah spoke. "Why did you help us?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Your reputation in town. Ethan set down his spoon, considering his words. "Couldn't let a wolf have its way," he said simply, reaching for the coffee pot. "Some men act worse than animals, treating women and children like that." "But you don't know my story," Mariah pressed, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her cup. "What they say about me." "Ma'am," Ethan interrupted gently, "what matters is what's true, not what folks say." Tears welled in Maria's eyes. She took a shaky breath, then spoke words that seemed to cost her dearly. "My husband cast me out because this child is not his." Ethan's shoulders stiffened, but he kept his face carefully neutral. He'd suspected as much from the townsfolk's muttering, but hearing it confirmed made the situation even more precarious. "The baby's father," Mariah continued, her voice growing stronger, "was Mateo Hernandez. He worked as a vaquero on the Triple R ranch." Her eyes took on a distant look. "He was kind and brave and full of songs. We fell in love last spring when my husband was away on business." She paused, brushing tears from her cheeks. "But then the railroad men came, trying to force the ranchers to sell. There was fighting. Mateo ... Her voice broke. "They shot him. Said it was self-defense, but it wasn't. He was trying to protect the ranch owner's water rights." Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew about the railroad disputes good men killed over water and land, their deaths wrapped up in neat legal packages that protected the powerful. "By then, I was already carrying his child," Mariah whispered, touching the baby's cheek. "When my husband returned and realized, he threw us out into the storm." She lifted her chin, a flash of defiance in her eyes. "I won't be ashamed of loving Mateo. This Niña is all I have left of him." Ethan pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the floor. The weight of what she'd told him settled on his shoulders like a heavy yoke. Protecting her meant standing against not just town gossip, but men who thought nothing of murder to get their way. "You're safe here," he said gruffly, gathering the dishes. "Both of you." After breakfast, Ethan announced he needed to check the fence lines. The work would give Mariah privacy to rest and tend to the baby. He spent the day writing his properties, boundaries, mending broken rails, and testing post stability. The physical labor helped clear his mind, but he couldn't shake the growing sense that life on his quiet ranch had changed forever. Night fell early, as it did in winter. Ethan sat in his chair by the fire, attempting to mend a bridle by lamplight. Through the thin walls of the house, he heard Mariah's voice floating down from the spare room upstairs. She was singing softly in Spanish a lullaby he guessed Mateo must have sung. The melody carried such tenderness and loss that Ethan's hands stilled on their work. He thought of Sarah, of the song she used to sing to their Catherine before the fever took them both. Grief recognized grief, forming a bridge of understanding between his loss and Mariah's. He set aside the bridle and stared into the flames, listening to the bittersweet song above. The railroad men would come looking eventually. Town gossip would turn to action. Trials lay ahead that would test them all. But for now, in the quiet of the ranch house, two broken hearts beat in rhythm with an ancient lullaby, sharing the weight of loves lost too soon. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Ethan guided his wagon between the weathered buildings. Fresh snow crunched beneath the wheels, and his breath formed clouds in the crisp air. He needed flour and kerosene basic supplies that normally meant a simple trip to town. But nothing felt simple anymore. Eyes followed his progress down the street. Shopkeepers paused their sweeping. Women drew their children closer. Ethan kept his gaze forward, his jaw set against the whispers that floated like dead leaves in his wake. Took in that cast-off woman, ... double quote. Gonna bring trouble, mark my words. Never thought McCall would get mixed up in such business, ... The mercantiles. Bell jangled as Ethan pushed through the door. Inside, the familiar sense of leather, coffee, and tobacco wrapped around him. Old Man Turner stood behind the counter, watching him with worried eyes. "Morning, Ethan," Turner said, his voice careful. "What can I get you?" 20 pounds of flour, Ethan replied evenly. "And 2 cans of kerosene." Turner nodded and shuffled to gather the supplies. The store wasn't empty. Several townspeople lingered, pretending to study shelves while stealing glances at Ethan. Their whispers weren't quite quiet enough. "Dangerous business, taking her in ... Railroad men won't like it ... The bell rang again. Sheriff Tom Rourke's solid frame filled the doorway, his badge catching the morning light. He removed his hat, revealing graying hair, and made his way to where Ethan stood. "McCall," the sheriff said quietly. "Got a moment?" Ethan nodded, following Rourke to a quiet corner near the seed displays. The sheriff's weathered face showed concern beneath its usual stern expression. "Word's spreading about your guest," Rourke began, keeping his voice low. "Those railroad men, they've been asking questions, making noise about her presence being some kind of challenge to their authority. A mother and baby, Tom?" Ethan's voice carried an edge. "That's what they're afraid of? You know it ain't that simple." Rourke glanced around before continuing. "That woman's connected to their troubles with the R Ranch. Her man was killed in that dispute. Having her around, it keeps that whole mess alive. So they'd rather she freeze to death?" Ethan's hands clenched at his sides. "That what passes for justice now?" "I'm just warning you, friend." Rourke placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Harboring her could drag you into trouble you don't need. Those men have friends in high places, and I have a promise to keep." Ethan stepped back from the sheriff's touch. "No woman and child will suffer on my watch. Not again." Turner called out that Ethan's supplies were ready. As he paid and loaded his wagon, the whispers followed him like shadows. But his back remained straight, his movements deliberate. "Let them talk. Back at the ranch, the afternoon sun had warmed the air enough that Mariah found the courage to step onto the front porch. The baby slept peacefully in her arms, wrapped in one of Sarah's old blankets that Ethan had offered. Fresh air filled her lungs as she gazed across the snow-covered pastures. The creak of wagon wheels announced Ethan's return. He drove past curious eyes from neighboring ranches, positioning his wagon to block their view of the porch. The simple gesture of protection made Mariah's throat tight with gratitude. As evening settled over the ranch, they sat at the kitchen table, bowls of rabbit stew steaming before them. The lantern cast a warm glow across the worn tablecloth while wind rattled the shutters outside. Mariah had managed to make the stew from provisions Ethan had on hand, a small way to repay his kindness. "Town was full of talk today," Ethan said, suddenly breaking the comfortable silence. His spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "Sheriff came to warn me about consequences." Mariah's hand trembled as she set down her spoon. Perhaps I should go. I don't want to bring trouble to your door." "No." Ethan's voice was firm but gentle. "I don't care what they say, you'll stay." The simple declaration hung in the air between them. Mariah clutched her sleeping daughter closer, understanding the weight of what he offered. This quiet man was willing to risk everything, his reputation, his safety, perhaps even his ranch, to protect them. Outside, the wind howled harder against the shutters, as if nature itself warned of storms gathering on the horizon. But inside the warm kitchen, Ethan continued eating his stew, his decision made, his course set. And Mariah, watching him across the lamplight, felt something she hadn't dared to feel since Mateo's death hope. The snow fell steadily through the night, blanketing the ranch in deep white drifts. By morning, the world outside had transformed into a hushed landscape of white peaks and valleys. The storm had effectively sealed them away from town, from prying eyes, from the growing tensions that waited beyond their fence line. Inside the ranch house, a gentle routine began to take shape. Mariah moved carefully through the rooms, her strength still limited from childbirth. Yet she found purpose in small tasks, stirring beans on the cookstove, threading needles to mend Ethan's worn shirts, sweeping away the dust that gathered in corners. The baby slept in a makeshift cradle fashioned from an old wooden box, lined with soft blankets. Ethan spent his mornings chopping wood, the rhythmic thunk of his axe echoing across the snow-covered yard. Every hour or so, he would stamp the snow from his boots and step inside, checking on mother and child. His presence was quiet but constant, like the warmth from the cooking fire he kept fed with split logs. "You don't need to work so hard," he told Maria one afternoon, watching her struggle with a particularly stubborn patch on his old work shirt. "Please," she replied softly. "It helps me feel useful." Her fingers moved steadily, though slower than usual. "Besides, this shirt has seen better days." Evenings brought them together by the fireplace, where shadows danced on the walls and conversation came easier. The baby would lie content in Mariah's arms, tiny fingers curled around her mother's thumb. These moments, wrapped in firelight and silence, slowly built bridges between their separate griefs. One such evening, Mariah spoke of Mateo, her voice warm with memory. "He had such dreams," she said, gazing into the flames. "He would talk about having our own piece of land someday. A place where our child could run free, where no one could tell us we didn't belong." She brushed a tear away. "He never got to see her." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of lost dreams. "Sarah, my wife, she wanted children more than anything." His voice grew rough with remembrance. "We tried for years. When she finally carried, we thought—" He trailed off, the old pain still sharp. Neither of them survived the fever. The baby chose that moment to coo softly, drawing both their attention. Mariah adjusted the blanket around her daughter, while Ethan watched, his expression softening. This tiny life between them somehow eased the ache of their separate losses, creating something new and unexpected. Yet Ethan noticed the shadows that sometimes crossed Mariah's face, especially when unexpected sounds broke the quiet, a branch scraping against a window, the distant cry of a coyote. He recognized the look of someone watching for danger, waiting for the other boot to drop. During supper one evening, as Mariah spooned soup into bowls, her hands trembled slightly. "What if he comes looking?" she whispered, not needing to specify who he was. Ethan set down his spoon, meeting her worried gaze across the table. "If he comes, he won't take you." His voice carried the same quiet certainty as the day he'd first brought them home. "Either of you." Later that night, after the dishes were cleaned and put away, Mariah sat in the rocking chair near the fire, humming softly to her daughter. The gentle creak of the runners against the floorboards created a peaceful rhythm in the quiet house. Ethan stepped outside into the crystal-clear night. The snow had finally stopped, and stars pierced the darkness like tiny holes in a black blanket. He walked a few paces from the house, then knelt in the snow, not feeling the cold seeping through his trousers. "Lord," he whispered, his breath visible in the frigid air, "am I doing right by them?" He waited, searching his heart for guidance. "Sarah always said you had a purpose for everything, even when we couldn't see it." No thundering voice answered from the heavens. No divine sign appeared in the star-studded sky. Yet as Ethan knelt there, surrounded by the vast silence of the snow-covered ranch, he felt a deep certainty settle in his chest. Leaving Mariah and her baby to die had never been an option. Whatever came next, whatever storms gathered on the horizon, he knew this truth down to his bones. From inside the house came the soft sound of Mariah's lullaby, carrying through the thin walls into the night. Ethan remained kneeling for a moment longer, letting the peace of the moment wash over him, before rising to return to the warmth inside. The storm that had locked them away finally broke, leaving behind a crystalline Sunday morning. Sunlight sparkled off fresh snow as Ethan hitched the horses to his wagon. He had spent extra time brushing down their coats and polishing the leather harnesses until they gleamed. Mariah emerged from the house wearing her best dress, a faded blue cotton she had carefully pressed the night before. The baby, wrapped snugly in a soft blanket, nestled against her chest. Ethan helped them both into the wagon, noting how Mariah's hands trembled slightly despite the calm morning. "We don't have to go," he said quietly, adjusting the blanket around them. Mariah straightened her shoulders. "The Lord's house should welcome everyone," she replied, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. The wagon wheels crunched through packed snow as they made their way toward town. Church bells rang clear across the valley, calling the faithful to worship. As they approached the white-painted building, Ethan could see dozens of horses and wagons already gathered, marking a full congregation inside. He pulled the wagon to a stop, helping Mariah down with careful hands. The baby made a soft sound, drawing curious glances from people filing into the church. Mariah held her daughter closer, as if to shield her from the stares. Inside, the wooden pews were packed tight with townspeople in their Sunday best. As Ethan and Mariah walked down the center aisle, a wave of whispers rippled through the congregation. Women pulled their skirts aside rather than let them brush against Mariah as she passed. Men who had once greeted Ethan warmly now turned their faces away. They found space in a back pew, where Ethan positioned himself between Mariah and the disapproving glares of the prominent ranchers seated across the aisle. The Coleman brothers, whose cattle operations sprawled across the northern valley, made their disdain clear with pointed looks and muttered comments. The preacher rose to deliver his sermon, his eyes darting uncomfortably between Ethan and Mariah and the influential ranchers. His usual steady voice faltered as he spoke of Christian charity and loving thy neighbor. When he reached a passage about judgment, he seemed to lose his place entirely, shuffling his papers with nervous hands. "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," the preacher quoted. Though his gaze carefully avoided their corner of the church, Mariah kept her eyes fixed on her sleeping daughter throughout the service, her face growing paler with each whispered comment that reached their ears. The baby stirred once, making small fussy sounds, and the sideways glances turned to open stares of disapproval. When the service ended, the usual warm fellowship of handshakes and conversation was notably absent. People hurried past them, creating a bubble of empty space around their pew. Ethan heard snippets of conversation as the congregation filed out. Ruined his good name, taking in that sort. What was McCall thinking? Outside, families who had once invited Ethan to Sunday dinner now hurried to their wagons, averting their eyes. Even old Mrs. Peterson, who had helped nurse Sarah in her final days, turned away when Maria tried to smile in greeting. The drive home stretched long and quiet. Ethan handled the reins with steady hands, appearing unbothered by the morning's cold reception. But he noticed how Maria seemed to fold in on herself, making her already small frame even tinier on the wagon seat. "Don't let their poison touch you," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Their opinions ain't worth the air they waste speaking them." Maria didn't respond, but her shoulders shook slightly with suppressed emotion. That evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Maria stood by the window watching the sun set. The baby slept peacefully in her cradle, unaware of the day's tensions. When Maria finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I could leave," she said, not turning around. "Find work in another town, perhaps. You shouldn't have to bear the weight of my troubles." Ethan set down the cup he had been drying and crossed the room in 3 long strides. "No," he said firmly, his voice rough with emotion. "This house has been empty too long." He gestured to the quiet rooms around them. "You and the baby belong here." Maria turned then, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But your reputation means nothing compared to doing what's right," Ethan finished. His expression softened as he looked at the sleeping infant. "You're staying, both of you." As night settled over the ranch, Maria sat in the rocking chair, near the fire, feeling the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath the runners. For the first time since Mateo's death, she felt the tentative stirrings of belonging. This weather-worn house with its solid walls and quiet protector had become more than just shelter. It was starting to feel like home. Dark clouds rolled in from the mountains without warning, bringing fierce winds that howled through the valley. Ethan stood at the window, watching the storm gather strength. His weathered hands gripped a steaming coffee cup as he tracked the threatening sky. "Looks like we're in for a big one," he muttered, more to himself than to Maria, who sat nearby nursing the baby. The first heavy snowflakes began to fall just after noon. By mid-afternoon, the wind had picked up to a scream, rattling the windows and whistling through every crack in the old ranch house. Ethan had just finished securing the livestock when he heard it, a massive crack followed by a thunderous crash from the barn. He rushed outside, snow stinging his face. Through the whiteout conditions, he could make out a terrible sight. The weight of accumulated snow had caused the western section of the barn roof to cave in. "Lord have mercy," he breathed, already calculating the damage. The door behind him opened and Maria appeared, the baby wrapped tightly against her chest in a sling made from an old shawl. "What happened?" she called over the wind. "Roof couldn't take the weight," Ethan answered, already trudging toward the barn. "Need to clear it before more comes down." Without hesitation, Maria followed him, grabbing a spare shovel from beside. "The house, I can help." Ethan turned to protest, concern for her still recovering strength, but the determination in her eyes stopped him. He simply nodded and led the way into the barn. The collapse had scattered tools and equipment everywhere. While Ethan began clearing snow from the damaged section, Maria moved methodically through the barn, gathering scattered hammers, nails, and other implements that had been knocked from their places. The baby remained surprisingly quiet throughout, soothed perhaps by her mother's steady movement. or the soft Spanish lullabies Mariah hummed as she worked. When Ethan needed tools or boards, Mariah was there, anticipating his needs and passing them up with careful precision. Hours passed as they worked together in the failing light. Ethan's muscles burned from the effort of clearing snow and securing replacement boards, but he pressed on. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the barn needed to be sound before nightfall. "Hold this steady," he called down to Mariah, positioning a long beam. She braced it without complaint, her small hands strong and sure despite the cold dot. As the last light faded, Ethan nailed the final board into place. The repair wasn't pretty, but it would hold until spring when he could do a proper job. He climbed down the ladder, his boots hitting the barn floor with a solid thud. Mariah stood nearby, brushing snow from her skirts. The baby had dozed off, her tiny face peaceful against her mother's chest. Looking at them, Ethan felt something shift inside him, a warmth he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. "You're stronger than you look," he said, gathering up the tools. Mariah smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "My father always said willing hands make light work." They made their way back to the house through deepening snow. Inside, the fire had burned low, but together they soon had it blazing again. While Ethan hung their wet coats by the hearth, Mariah set about preparing a simple supper of cornbread and beans. The lamp cast a gentle glow as they ate, both too tired for much conversation. The baby lay in her cradle nearby, occasionally making soft sleeping sounds. Outside, the storm continued. Its assault, but inside was warm and peaceful. After the dishes were cleared, Mariah settled in the rocking chair with her daughter. As she had every night since arriving, she began to sing her lullaby, a gentle Mexican melody about stars and angels. But tonight was different. Without planning to, Ethan found himself humming along, his deep voice falling naturally into harmony with her sweet soprano. Mariah's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't falter. Their voices twined together, filling the room with something that felt remarkably like joy. When the song ended, a comfortable silence fell. Ethan stoked the fire, watching the flames dance. His hands still ached from the day's work, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. Working alongside Mariah, seeing her strength and determination had awakened something he'd thought long dead. As he sat in his chair by the fire, Ethan felt the presence of God more strongly than he had since losing Sarah. It wasn't a thunderbolt of revelation or a burning bush, just a quiet certainty that the Lord was at work, mending what grief had broken in him. The baby made a small sound, and Maria smoothed her tiny back. Ethan watched them, allowing himself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to have joy in this house again. Not to replace what he'd lost, but to build something new from the ashes of the past. The fire burned low, casting soft shadows on the walls. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the old ranch house, something precious and fragile was taking root. The first pale light of dawn crept across the snow-covered ranch when Ethan heard it, the distant thunder of hoofbeats, breaking the morning silence. He set down his coffee cup and moved to the window, his body tensing as he made out multiple riders approaching through the gray light. "Mariah," he called softly, not turning from the window, "take the baby to the back room." She looked up from where she'd been folding clean linens, her face going pale as she heard the horses. Without a word, she gathered her sleeping daughter and disappeared into the rear of the house. Ethan stepped onto the porch, his rifle hanging casual but ready in his grip. The winter air bit through his wool shirt as he watched 6 men ride up, their horses' breath steaming in the cold. He recognized James Morton, the railroad foreman. At their head, a hard-faced man in expensive coat. The riders reined in their horses in the yard, spreading out in a way that made the hair on Ethan's neck rise. All of them wore guns, though none had drawn yet. "McCall," Morton called out, his voice carrying across the frozen ground. "We've come about the Mexican woman." Ethan didn't move from his position on the porch. She's under my protection. Morton's face darkened. That child she carries makes false claims on railroad interests. We can't have that. A baby makes no claims, Ethan replied evenly. And you won't be coming inside my house. One of Morton's men shifted in his saddle, hand drifting toward his gun. Morton held up a gloved hand, stopping him. Listen here, McCall. That woman's dead lover was making trouble, stirring up questions about land rights that were already settled. Now she's trying to use his bastard to keep those claims alive. Morton leaned forward in his saddle. It's nothing to you. Step aside. Ethan's grip tightened on his rifle, though he kept it pointed down. You're wrong on both counts. It is something to me, and I won't be stepping aside. You're choosing a dangerous path, Morton warned. Think carefully about making enemies of the wrong people. I reckon I already thought on it, Ethan said quietly. And I reckon you boys best ride out now. The tension stretched like a wire, about to snap. Morton stared hard at Ethan, measuring his resolve. Finally, he straightened in his saddle. This isn't over, McCall. He wheeled his horse around. You remember that. Ethan stood motionless as the riders turned and galloped away, their hoofbeats fading into the morning stillness. Only when they were completely gone did he lower his rifle and go back inside. He found Mariah in the kitchen, the baby now awake and fussing in her arms. Her face was drawn with fear and something else, guilt. I heard, she said softly. They came because of me. Ethan set his rifle in its place by the door. Best you tell me everything now. Mariah sank into a chair, cradling her daughter close. Mateo, he discovered papers, proof that the railroad had taken land from Mexican families through false contracts. He was gathering evidence, building a case. Her voice caught. Then one night, he didn't come home. They said it was an accident at the construction site, but tears slid down her cheeks as she continued. Now they fear I have those papers, that I'll use them to claim Mateo's share of the disputed land for our daughter. But I don't have them. I don't know where they are. She looked up at Ethan, her eyes full of anguish. I've brought their anger to your door. I've cursed your household with my troubles. The baby's cries grew louder. Mariah tried to soothe her, but her own hands were shaking too badly. Ethan crossed the room and knelt beside her chair. Gently, he steadied her trembling hands with his own. Listen to me, he said firmly. You haven't cursed anything. The Lord don't bless cowards, and he sure don't bless men who prey on widows and orphans. He met her tear-filled gaze. Whatever. Comeys will face it. Mariah drew a shaky breath, trying to believe his words. The baby gradually quieted, soothed by their still hands and steady voices. But even as Ethan spoke words of comfort, he knew the railroad men's visit was only the beginning. Morton and his kind wouldn't give up easily. They had too much to lose if their schemes came to light. The simple act of sheltering a mother and child had drawn him into a fight with forces far bigger than town gossip. He watched Mariah rock her daughter, remembering Morton's cold eyes and the implicit threat in his words. The morning sun streamed through the window, catching the tears on Mariah's cheeks, and Ethan silently renewed his promise to protect them, whatever the cost. 2 days after the railroad men's visit, winter sunshine glinted off the snow as Ethan checked his cattle in the lower pasture. The morning had started peaceful enough. He'd left Mariah kneading bread dough while the baby slept in a basket near the warm stove. Now as he counted the last of his herd, the crunch of approaching hoofbeats made him turn sharply. A lone rider appeared, pushing his horse hard through the snow. Something about his bearing set Ethan's instincts on edge. The stranger rode straight for the ranch house, not even glancing at Ethan in the pasture. Ethan mounted quickly, spurring his horse toward home. By the time he reached the yard, he heard Mariah's frightened cry from inside. The stranger, a well-dressed man with a cruel twist to his mouth, had already dismounted and was striding toward the house. Sarah, the man shouted, using a name Ethan had never heard. "Get out here, you faithless woman." Ethan swung down from his horse, his boots hitting the packed snow with a crunch. "That's far enough, mister." The man whirled, his face flushed with anger. "This is none of your concern, rancher. That's my wife in there, and I've come to collect what's mine by law." Through the window, Ethan could see Mariah pressed against the far wall, clutching her baby tight. Her face was white with terror. "The lady doesn't want to see you," Ethan said, keeping his voice steady as he moved to block the door. "Best you." "Right on. The lady?" The man spat in the snow. "That's Sarah Martinez, my legal wife. She ran off, heavy with another man's bastard." His hand drifted toward his gun. "Now stand aside. A husband has rights. Not in my house he doesn't." Ethan's words were quiet but firm as steel. "That baby is 2 weeks old, and the mother nearly died in the snow. You cast them out to freeze. You've got no rights here." The man's face twisted with rage. "You think you can steal my property? I'll be back with the sheriff and the law. We'll see who has rights then." He jabbed a finger at the house. "You hear that, Sarah? Pack your things. When I return, you're coming home, and that Mexican brat can go to the orphan's home where it belongs. Leave," Ethan said, taking one step forward. "Now." Something in Ethan's eyes must have warned the man, because he backed away, stumbling slightly in the snow. He mounted his horse awkwardly, still shouting threats. "You'll regret interfering, rancher. The law's on my side." Ethan watched until the rider disappeared down the road. Only then did he hurry inside. Mariah had sunk to the floor, her whole body shaking as she cradled the baby. "James," she whispered. "I never thought he would find me here." Ethan knelt beside her. "Did he hurt you?" She shook her head. "He only pounded on the door and shouted." "But Ethan," fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, "he is right. The law is his. A wife is property, and I ran away. I should go with him, spare you this trouble." "No." Ethan's voice was fierce. "Listen to me. That man cast you out to die. He has no claim on you or this child. But the sheriff, let me worry about the sheriff." Ethan helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. "No man will drag you back to misery. Not while I draw breath." The baby began to cry, perhaps sensing her mother's distress. Mariah tried to soothe her, but her hands were trembling too badly. "Here," Ethan said gently, taking the child. "Sit down. I'll fetch you some water." The rest of the day passed in heavy silence. The bread dough was forgotten, left to overrise in its bowl. Neither of them felt much like eating, but Ethan insisted Mariah try to keep up her strength. They shared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, speaking little as darkness fell. Ethan could see fear stealing over Mariah's face again. She jumped at every night sound, every creak of the house settling. "Try to rest," he told her. "I'll keep watch." She retreated to her room with the baby, but Ethan could hear her soft crying through the thin walls. He settled into his chair by the fireplace, rifle across his knees, and tried to pray. "Lord," he whispered into the quiet house, "I need your wisdom now. Show me how to protect them. Show me the right path." The fire crackled and popped, throwing shadows on the wall. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the snow. Ethan kept his vigil through the long night hours, watching the flames dance and listening for riders, while above him the stars wheeled cold and bright in the winter sky. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Ethan hitched the horses to his wagon. His movements were quick but careful, each buckle and strap checked twice. Behind him, the ranch house door creaked open, and Mariah emerged with her baby bundled against the morning chill. "You're certain about this?" she asked, her voice thin. With worry, Ethan nodded, helping her up onto the wagon seat. "We need to know where we stand with the law. Best to face it head on." The wagon wheels crunched through crusty snow as they made their way toward town. Neither spoke much during the journey. Mariah hummed softly to her sleeping child, while Ethan kept his eyes fixed on the road, his thoughts churning like the wheels beneath them. The sheriff's office sat at the end of the main street, its windows reflecting the morning sun. Ethan helped Mariah down, noting how the few townsfolk out this early turned away or crossed to the other side of the street. Sheriff Rourke was at his desk when they entered, the smell of coffee thick in the air. He looked up from his paperwork, his weathered face carefully neutral. "McCall," he said, nodding. "Ma'am, Sheriff." Ethan remained standing while Maria took the offered chair. "We need to know where the law stands." Rourke sighed, rubbing his mustache. "It ain't good news, Ethan. A husband's rights are pretty clear in these parts. Unless there's proof of serious harm." "He left her to die in the snow," Ethan cut in, his voice hard. "And who saw that?" Rourke spread his hands. "Look, I believe you both. But the law needs more than just your word against his." Mariah clutched her baby closer. "Please," she whispered. "He will take my daughter." The sheriff's eyes softened with genuine regret. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Without some kind of proof or legal standing, there's not much I can do when he comes back with papers." They left the office with heavy hearts, the morning sun now feeling more harsh than warming. Ethan steered them toward the mercantile, knowing they needed supplies despite their troubles. Inside the store, the usual friendly chatter died as they entered. The shopkeeper's wife turned her back, while two ranchers' wives gathered their skirts and hurried out. Ethan felt Mariah shrink beside him, but he kept his head high as he collected flour, coffee, and other necessities. As they stepped back outside, a figure separated itself from the shadows of the building's porch. He was an elderly native man, his face deeply lined, but his eyes sharp and clear. Ethan recognized him as Gray Hawk, one of the few Ute elders who still occasionally traded in town. The old man raised his hand in greeting, then spoke in careful English. "The truth has roots," he said, his voice low but carrying clearly. "Deep. Roots that hold against the strongest wind." Ethan frowned, studying the elder's face. There was something in his manner that suggested more than simple philosophy. "You know something about this?" Gray Hawk glanced at Mariah and the baby, then back to Ethan. "Perhaps. But such words need quiet air to grow." Understanding dawned. Ethan helped Mariah into the wagon, then turned back to the elder. "Our ranch is 5 miles north. You would be welcome this evening." The old man nodded once, then melted back into the shadows of the porch. The sun was setting when Gray Hawk's horse appeared on the horizon. Ethan met him in the yard, while Maria waited anxiously by the door, her baby asleep in her arms, inside. As lamplight cast warm shadows on the walls, Gray Hawk accepted a cup of coffee. He sipped slowly, gathering his thoughts. "I knew the one called Mateo," he finally said. "He was different from other outsiders. He respected our ways, learned our stories. Before he died, he trusted me with something." Mariah's breath caught. "You knew Mateo?" The elder nodded. "He spoke often of you, of the child you carried. He feared the railroad men would come for the land, so he gave me his proof." From inside his coat, Gray Hawk withdrew a folded paper, brown with age but still clearly legible. A deed, signed and witnessed in Denver. The land was his, bought fair. The railroad's claim is built on sand. Ethan took the document carefully, reading by lamplight. The legal language was clear. Mateo had owned the disputed acres outright. Mariah began to weep softly, clutching her baby. "He never told me," she whispered. "He was protecting us both." "This changes everything," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "This proves the railroad men murdered an honest landowner. No wonder they wanted to silence you." Gray Hawk nodded. Gravely, "The truth rises like water from deep springs. It cannot stay buried forever. Forever." Ethan saw it then, God's hand moving in ways he never expected, using this quiet elder to bring justice to light. He looked at Mariah, saw hope beginning to replace fear in her eyes, and felt his own faith strengthening like winter wheat under snow. The deed lay heavy in Ethan's hands as he opened his strongbox. The metal container, scarred and worn from years of use, held what few valuable papers he owned: his own land title, his marriage certificate, and now this document that could change everything. He placed Mateo's deed carefully inside, beneath the other papers, and locked it tight. Outside the window, winter sunshine glinted off patches of melting snow. Mariah sat in the rocking chair, humming to her daughter as she nursed. The baby's tiny hand reached up, catching a strand of her mother's dark hair. "It feels strange," Mariah said softly, "knowing Mateo left us this protection without ever telling me." Ethan tucked the strongbox back into its hiding place behind a loose floorboard. "He was trying to keep you both safe. Sometimes love means carrying burdens alone." Through the window, they spotted riders on the distant road, railroad men making their daily patrol. Mariah tensed, but Ethan kept his voice steady. "They can't touch us here." Not without cause. The days fell into a careful rhythm. Each morning, Ethan rose before dawn to tend the stock, his boots crunching through frost as he carried feed to the corrals. Mariah would have coffee waiting when he returned, the baby cooing in her basket nearby. During the day, Ethan split wood until the pile grew mountain high. The steady thunk of his axe became a comfort to Mariah as she worked inside, knowing he was close. Sometimes she would step onto the porch just to watch him, his sure movements, the way he paused to wipe his brow, how he always glanced up to check on her. Evenings brought peace. After supper, they would sit by the fire while Ethan read from his worn Bible. His voice, rough from years of trail dust, grew gentle with the familiar words. Mariah would rock her daughter, listening to stories of faith tested and promises kept. One night, as the flames danced low, Mariah spoke of Mateo's dreams. "He wanted a place where our child could run free," she said, stroking her daughter's cheek. "Where no one would look down on her for being both Mexican and American." Ethan nodded slowly. "My Sarah wanted children so bad. We tried for years, but the only one we had lived just 3 days." He paused, the old grief settling soft as ash. "She made me promise to help any mother I could." "You've kept that promise," Mariah whispered. The baby chose that moment to let out a happy gurgle, reaching toward the firelight. Ethan found himself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in years. Something warm and unexpected bloomed. In his chest, hope maybe, or the first tentative seeds of joy. He caught himself imagining summer evenings, the baby taking wobbly steps in the yard, Mariah hanging wash on the line, singing her gentle songs. Maybe even, but no, he shouldn't let his mind wander too far ahead. The crack of gunfire shattered the night. Ethan was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. Mariah clutched the baby, who woke with a startled wail. More shots rang out, closer this time, warning shots fired into the air near the ranch house. "Get away from the windows," Ethan ordered, his voice tight. He moved through the darkened house, checking each room. Through the glass, he caught glimpses of movement riders circling in the moonlight. Just beyond the yard, Mariah huddled in the corner, trying to quiet her crying child. "They know about the deed," she whispered. "They must know." Another shot cracked the night. This one struck the porch post, sending splinters flying. Ethan's hands tightened on his rifle as he positioned himself between the windows and his charges. "They're trying to scare us," he said grimly, "testing our nerve." The baby's cries echoed through the house. Outside, a horse whinnied. Then came a voice, calling through the darkness. "Better think hard about your choices, McCall. Ain't no future in standing against progress." Ethan's jaw clenched. More hoofbeats sounded, then gradually faded into the night. Still, he kept his vigil until dawn began to paint the eastern sky in pale strokes. When he finally lowered his rifle, his arms were stiff from holding it so long. Mariah had dozed off in the corner, her baby nestled against her chest. The sight made his heart clench. They looked so vulnerable, yet so precious. He knelt beside them, gently touching Mariah's shoulder. She startled awake, fear flooding her eyes before recognition set in. "They're gone," he said softly. "For now." Mariah drew a shaky breath. "What will we do?" Ethan stood, moving to stoke the dying fire. "We'll do what needs doing. Tend the stock. Keep watch. Trust in the Lord." He turned back to her, his face set with determination. "I made you a promise, Mariah. I aim to keep it." Outside, the first birds began their morning songs, oblivious to the night's violence. But Ethan's hand never strayed far from his rifle. The enemy had shown their hand. The real fight was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered yard as Ethan hitched the horses to his wagon. His movements were deliberate, each buckle and strap checked twice. Inside the house, Mariah wrapped her baby in thick blankets, her hands trembling slightly. "Are you certain about this?" she asked as Ethan helped her into the wagon. "Running and hiding ain't God's way," he replied, tucking a heavy quilt around her and the child. "Time to face what's coming." The wagon wheels creaked as they set out, breaking through crusted snow. Ethan's rifle lay within easy reach, though he prayed he wouldn't need it. The baby slept peacefully against Mariah's chest, unaware of the tension in her mother's shoulders. Late afternoon shadows stretched across the trail as they approached town. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin columns against the darkening sky. A bell began to toll, calling folks to evening service. "Trust in the Lord," Ethan said softly, as much to himself as to Mariah. He pulled the wagon to a stop outside the white-painted church. Light spilled from its windows, and voices murmured inside. Ethan helped Mariah down, then carefully took her sleeping baby in his arms. The child stirred but didn't wake, tiny fingers curling against his rough coat. They paused at the church steps. Mariah's breath came quick and shallow. "I'm right here beside you," Ethan assured her. The doors creaked as they entered. Heads turned, conversations halted. The preacher stood at his pulpit, mouth open in mid-sentence. In the sudden silence, Ethan's boots echoed on the wooden floor as he walked down the center aisle. He stopped before the altar, turning to face the congregation. Familiar faces stared back, the mercantile owner, ranchers, miners, their wives and children. Some were expressions of surprise, others scowled with disapproval. Ethan held the baby girl carefully, making sure everyone could see her innocent face. His voice, when it came, filled the hushed space with quiet authority. "I stand before you tonight with a truth that needs speaking," he began. "You all know me. Known me 20 years or more. Never been one for many words, but silence ain't right anymore." He looked down at the sleeping child, then back at the congregation. "This here's a child of God, pure as the snow outside. Yet some would cast her and her mother out to die in that snow, all on account of man's laws." Murmurs rippled through the pews. Someone scoffed near the back. Ethan's voice grew stronger. "I've heard your whispers, how I'm ruining my good name, how I'm going against proper ways. Well, I reckon there's a higher law than what's written in man's books. God's law says we protect the widow and the orphan. Says we show mercy." The preacher shifted uncomfortably at his pulpit. A few heads nodded slowly, while others turned away. "Man's law once said my own granddaddy could own another human being," Ethan continued. "Was that God's law? No. Sometimes man's law needs correcting." Movement at the back of the church drew attention. Gray Hawk stepped forward, his moccasins silent. On the floor, in his weathered hands, he held a folded paper. "The young one's father, Mateo, came to me before death," Gray Hawk said, his dignified voice carrying clearly. "He trusted me with truth. Here is deed to land railroad men claim. Land they killed him to take. Gasps filled the church as Gray Hawk unfolded the document. The preacher stepped down from his pulpit, hands shaking as he took the deed and read it. This is legitimate," the preacher said, his voice unsteady. "Dated and signed proper, before any railroad claims." More murmurs swept the room, louder now. The preacher's shoulders slumped as he handed the deed back to Gray Hawk. "I have failed," the preacher admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Failed my flock. Failed the Lord. I let fear of powerful men overcome God's call for justice." He turned to face his congregation, "But I aim to make it right. From this day forward, this church stands with truth. Stands with mercy. With mercy." The baby chose that moment to wake, making soft cooing sounds. Ethan gently rocked her, and several women in the front pews smiled despite themselves. "This child deserves a chance," Ethan said quietly. "Her mama deserves protection. That's all. I'm asking, help us make this right." Mariah stepped forward then, standing tall beside Ethan. Tears shone in her eyes, but her voice was clear as she spoke. "My Mateo died believing in justice," she said. "Believing his daughter would know a better world. Please help us honor that belief." The church fell silent. Snow began falling outside the windows, soft and steady in the gathering dusk. Then, slowly, people began to rise from their pews. The mercantile owner's wife was first, coming forward to touch the baby's cheek. Others followed, forming a circle of support around Ethan, Mariah, and their precious charge. The church doors burst open, letting in a blast of cold air. Sheriff Rourke stumbled backward as the railroad foreman and Mariah's husband stormed up the steps, their boots thundering on wood. "Sheriff, you arrest that woman right now," Mariah's husband demanded, his face red with rage. "She's my legal property." The congregation pressed closer together. Ethan shifted the baby to one arm, his other hand ready near his belt. But before he could move, Sheriff Rourke planted himself between the angry men and the church gathering. "Now hold on," the sheriff said, his voice steady. "I've just witnessed testimony and seen legal proof that changes things considerable." The railroad foreman jabbed a finger toward Gray Hawk. "That Indian's word means nothing. We have legitimate claims, you have lies," Gray Hawk interrupted calmly, holding up the deed. "This paper speaks truth about Mateo's land. About your murders," townsfolk murmured, moving to stand beside Ethan and Mariah. The mercantile owner stepped forward, then the blacksmith, and soon a wall of neighbors blocked the church aisle. "Get out," someone called. "We don't want your kind here anymore." Mariah's husband reached for his gun, but Sheriff Rourke's hand moved faster. "Don't," the sheriff warned. "Just don't." The railroad men backed away, their power broken by united hearts. "This ain't over," Mariah's husband snarled, but his voice shook. Later that night, after the long ride home, Ethan's ranch house glowed with warmth. Gray Hawk sat with them at the supper table, sharing bread and stew. The baby slept peacefully in a makeshift cradle nearby. "I've been nothing but trouble to you," Mariah said softly to Ethan. He looked up from his plate, his eyes gentle. "You were never that." Their gazes held as the baby cooed in her sleep. A smile passed between them, carrying more meaning than words could say. Spring swept across the Colorado range like God's own paintbrush. The last patches of snow melted into sweet-scented mud, and tiny purple wildflowers dotted the ranch yard. Inside the barn, wood shavings curled around Ethan's boots as he worked, carefully smoothing the edges of a pine cradle. His hands, rough from ranch work, moved with gentle precision over the wood. Mariah watched from the barn door, tears gleaming in her eyes. The baby cooed in her arms, reaching toward floating dust motes in the sunlight. Each stroke of Ethan's playing spoke of love not just for the child, but for the family they were becoming. On a bright afternoon in April, the preacher rode out from town. Gray Hawk arrived too, his weathered face peaceful as he took his place beneath the old cottonwood tree. Mariah dressed the baby in a tiny white dress and bonnet, spring flowers tucked in the lace. They stood together in the yard, where months ago Ethan had first brought them through winter's fury. Now wildflowers danced around their feet as they spoke their vows. The baby gurgled between them, a living bridge joining past to future. After the ceremony, neighbors began arriving, the same ones who had once whispered and turned away. They brought fresh bread, pies, and quiet words of peace. Children played in the yard while adults shared coffee and stories on the porch. As evening settled over the ranch, Ethan and Mariah sat by the hearth. The baby slept soundly in her new cradle, pine wood gleaming in the firelight. Ethan took Mariah's hand, his voice thick with emotion. "No one's ever leaving you to die again," he whispered. "You're home." Mariah's fingers tightened around his. Together they watched the flames dance, their hearts finally healing in the warmth of love restored. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.